Good afternoon and welcome to the first annual Nuclear Science and Engineering Department lecture on scientific and technical communication in the 21st century. For those of you who I haven't met, and I think there may be a few people in the room that meet that definition, my name's Richard Lester. I'm head of the Nuclear Science and Engineering Department, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Steven Pinker back to MIT. As some of you know, I think, Professor Pinker spent more than 20 years on the MIT faculty in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science before leaving in 2003 for Harvard, actually returning to Harvard where he received his PhD a number of years ago, and where he's now the Harvard College professor and the Johnstone family professor in the Department of Psychology. He's a cognitive scientist and a linguist who's made many important contributions to research on the development of language in the course of his scientific career. He's also published a number of widely read and award-winning books for a general audience, including The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Stuff of Thought, and his most recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, an inquiry into the origins of human violence, why violence has diminished over the millennia, and why we're living in the most peaceful era that humanity has ever experienced. Now, this is a nuclear science and engineering department seminar. In fact, it's officially the first session in the NSE doctoral seminar this fall, and some of you may be wondering about what may seem to be a rather unlikely juxtaposition of subjects. In fact, it's less unlikely than you might think. The students in nuclear science and engineering, like many other MIT students, but perhaps more than some, understand the essential role of clear, engaging, effective communication of complex scientific and engineering subjects, not only to their peers, but also to people in government, and maybe more important, almost certainly more important, to the general public. They understand that this is actually an important aspect, an integral part, really, of being an effective engineer, and that it is something that can be thought about, worked at, and planned for. And that same subject, how to communicate complex scientific and technical information clearly and engagingly, is also one to which Steve Pinker has given a great deal of thought over the years in his writing, in his lecturing, and in his research. And in fact, this subject will be the topic of his next book. And this is the first time that Steve has begun to talk about his next book, whose title will be The Sense of Style. And that is, in fact, the title of his lecture today. And we're delighted that he's going to talk to us about the sense of style, scientific communication for the 21st century. Steve, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come back to MIT, which still feels like home, an institute for which I have tremendous respect and affection. I'd like to thank the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering and Professor Lester and Dr. Eleveno Subaya, who made this talk possible. I think that all of us agree, as Professor Lester said, that communicating science is one of our chief priorities as scientists and science educators. It is relevant to the public understanding of hot-button issues such as evolution, climate change, vaccines, and not least nuclear energy. It's through the lucid and persuasive communication of science that the public is informed on these issues. It's essential in recruiting new scientists. Many young people decide on a life of science after having been stimulated or excited by great science writers like Carl Sagan, Richard Dawkins, and Brian Greene. It's essential in promoting the scientific worldview, to communicate the excitement and passion of science and the value of scientific principles such as reason, evidence, skepticism of authority and dogma, and an appreciation of the beauty, wonder, and humanity of science. This is a topic that should be of particular interest in a university because competence in writing skill is generally considered the signature accomplishment of a university education. If you learn anything at a university, you ought to learn how to write well. We can all agree on that. In exit surveys of graduates and surveys of employers of what they expect to come out of a university education, competence in writing is high on the list. This is certainly true of MIT alumni. When I was on the faculty, I was on the committee that revamped the communications requirement, so you can blame me, at least in part. And that was motivated in large part by the fact that our alumni at MIT indicated that they felt that they had not been suitably prepared for skill in writing at the time. However, there's some reasons to think that we are not succeeding. And I'll just give you a few examples from the most recent papers that I graded before writing this talk. Object affordances defined by shape and manipulability provide cues such that humans do not require much time experimenting with an object in order to discover how it functions. That, to translate that into English, that is, people sometimes know how to use a tool just by looking at it. It may be that some missing genes are more contributive to the spatial deficit. In other words, the spatial deficit might be caused by missing genes. Or if adoptive siblings are more closely related than random pairs of people not raised together, then an important effect of shared environment would be suggested. That is, if adopted siblings are similar, they must have been affected by the environment they shared. Well, how is writing often taught in universities, particularly in graduate programs today? Well, when I ask my colleagues how they prepare their own graduate students for writing, most of them say, well, I tell them to go out and read this, the classic Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White. William Strunk was a professor at Cornell, born in 1869. E.B. White was his student and later the famous New Yorker writer and author of children's books such as Stuart Little and Charlotte's Web. White had kept his professor's course notes, turned them into a book with the permission of his estate, and it is now by far the best known manual on writing style. And for good reason. There is much good sense and charm in the Elements of Style, and I highly recommend it. It offers timeless advice like use definite, specific, concrete language, write with nouns and verbs, put the emphatic words at the end, and omit needless words. And together with its sound advice, there's a great deal of wit and charm. Here, for example, is White in a preface reminiscing about the lectures of his beloved Professor Strunk. In the days when I was sitting in his class, he omitted so many needless words and omitted them so forcibly and with such eagerness and obvious relish that he often seemed in the position of having shortchanged himself, a man left with nothing more to say, yet with time to fill. Will Strunk got out of this predicament by a simple trick. He uttered every sentence 3 times. When he delivered his oration on brevity to the class, he leaned forward over his desk, grabbed his coat lapels in his hands, and in a husky conspiratorial voice said, Rule 17, omit needless words, omit needless words, omit needless words. Well, though I still highly recommend the Elements of Style, there are a number of reasons why it should not be the basis of writing instruction in the 21st century, at least not the sole basis. One is that although much of the advice is quite good, much of the advice is utterly baffling, such as the word people is not to be used with words of number in place of persons. That is, it's an error to say 6 people. You should say 6 persons. Why? Well, see if you can follow the logic. If of 6 people, 5 went away, how many people would be left? That is intended to be a reductio ad absurdum. But of course, what it would mean is you shouldn't use words like children or teeth or mice or any other irregular nouns, because if 6 children went away, how many children would be left? The logic is the same. So this is a rather dubious explanation. The verb to contact is vague and self-important. Do not contact people. Get in touch with them, look them up, phone them, find them, or meet them. Well, yeah, but what if you have to email them, instant message them, or if you deliberately want to be non-committal about how you are to get in touch with someone? Well, the verb to contact is actually pretty useful. And by now, it was a vogue word in their day, but now it has become completely unexceptionable. On the word clever, notice that the word means one thing when applied to people, another when applied to horses. A clever horse is a good-natured one, not an ingenious one. Well, as we say in the 21st century, another problem is that Strunk and White often contradict themselves. Their own advice flouts itself, as in the classic, I don't believe this was ironic, the subject of a sentence and the principal verb should not, as a rule, be separated by a phrase or clause that can be transferred to the beginning. Well, I'm glad to see that you can all see the problem, namely that the subject of a sentence, the subject of this sentence, which I indicate in green, and the principal verb of the sentence, which I indicated in orange, are separated by, as a rule, indicated in black. If they were to follow their own advice, it should be, as a rule, the subject of a sentence and the principal verb should not be separated. This does not, in fact, improve the sentence, which casts doubt on the wisdom of that very advice. For that matter, the bit of advice, use the active voice, is also flouted by that sentence. The subject should not be separated by a phrase or a clause. And there's a reason, I think, why they did not realize they were flouting their own rules. And that is that they had a rather shaky grasp of basic grammatical constructions, such as the passive voice. Neither of them knew anything about linguistics or grammatical theory. Strunk was a literature professor, White an essayist. And when they try to give examples of the passive voice, they offer the following. At dawn, the crowing of a rooster could be heard. OK, that is indeed an example of a sentence in the passive voice. But there are other examples. There were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground, no passive. It was not long before she was very sorry that she had said what she had, no passive. And the reason that he left college was that his health became impaired. Again, that is not a verb in the passive voice. That is an adjective. So they score 1 for 4 in explaining what the passive voice is. In general, the problem with traditional style manuals is that they tend to consist of arbitrary lists of do's and don'ts, mostly based on the tastes and peeves of the authors. And even when those tastes are highly refined, as they are in the case of Strunk and White, they can often lead the user astray. There's no principled understanding of how language and style work, and as a result, students and users in general have no way of understanding and assimilating the advice. They're just arbitrary diktats or commandments, and much of the advice is just plain wrong. I think we can do better today because we can benefit from advances made in the sciences of language, in grammatical theory, much of it pioneered here in the linguistics and philosophy department at MIT. Sociolinguistics, how language develops across a society. Experimental psycholinguistics, also carried out vigorously here at MIT by my former colleague and good friend Ted Gibson, who I believe is in the audience. And cognitive science more generally, how the mind works. What are the mental processes that are involved in composing and understanding sentences? I'm going to give you an overview of 4 possible applications of the modern science of language to the two principles of good composition. One of them is a model of good prose communication, how language works and sometimes doesn't work, the cognitive limitations that make writing so difficult, and how we should think about correct usage. So let me start with a model of prose communication. This is really ought to be the starting point, because good style should not be an afterthought implemented as a final polishing. That is, you write something, then you go back and you fix all the mistakes and you get good style. Rather, good style derives from a specific mental model of how written communication ought to work. What are you actually trying to accomplish when you, as we used to say, put pen to paper? And I'll rely on a model called classic style, a tacit model of prose communication, and I owe much to a wonderful book by Francis-Noël Thomas and the linguist Mark Turner called Clear and Simple as the Truth. The model of prose communication behind classic style is what psychologists call joint attention. That is, the writer orients the reader to something in the world which the reader can see with his own eyes. That's what you should be thinking that you're doing when you compose scientific or expository prose. You got the reader, you point the reader to something in the world, you direct the reader's attention to what you are currently attending to. So the tacit goal of prose communication is to help the reader see reality, and the style is conversation. Let me now explain what that means, because it just sounds so obvious. What is the alternative? Well, there are alternatives, and most academic prose, indeed, completely flouts this model of how communication works. So the assumptions of classic style are that truth can be known, prose is a window into an objectively existing world, the writer and reader are both competent to perceive that world, the thought can stand alone and precedes the word, that is, writing is not thinking, and that thoughts are concrete images. An agent applies force to an object, and an object either moves or stays put. That primitive way of conceiving the world is the one that ultimately prose aims at conveying. So for these reasons, classic prose is not relativist, ironic, romantic, or postmodern. And not coincidentally, it is, or ought to be, highly congenial to the worldview of the scientist, who also believes that there is an objective reality that exists independent of our words. And by the same token, it's the worst nightmare of the postmodernist. And not coincidentally, some of our best writers today are scientists, and some of our worst writers are postmodernists. I'll give you an example of what I mean by classic prose. And this comes from a book by Richard Dawkins, the blind watchmaker, on the coevolution in the animal kingdom of extreme male traits and extreme female preferences. Why do we have extravagant displays like the peacock's tail or the tail of the widow bird, which is many times the length of the bird? Darwin pointed out that you could understand it if the female, in choosing which males to mate with, basically forced males to have a beauty contest. And if females had preference for longer tails, mated with the males with the longer tails, the result over many generations would be males with longer tails. Why would they get so extreme? Well, you can get well, in fact, I'll let Dawkins do the talking or the writing of how these extremes can occur. Dawkins uses the analogy, tries to explain the concept of a set of stable equilibria. That is, you can have some species in which the females prefer just slightly longer tails, and the males will have slightly longer tails. You can have other species where if the females, for whatever reason, prefer even longer tails, the males will evolve with longer tails. And he uses the following analogy. Suppose that a room has both a heating device and a cooling device, each with its own thermostat. Both thermostats are set to keep the room at the same fixed temperature, 70 degrees. If the temperature drops below 70, the heater turns itself on and the refrigerator turns itself off. If the temperature rises above 70, the refrigerator turns itself on and the heater turns itself off. The analog of the widow bird's tail length is not the temperature, which remains constant at 70 degrees, but the total rate of consumption of electricity. The point is that there are lots of different ways in which the desired temperature can be achieved. It can be achieved by both devices working very hard, the heater belting out hot air and the refrigerator working flat out to neutralize the heat. Or it can be achieved by the heater putting out a bit less heat and the cooler working correspondingly less hard to neutralize it. Or it can be achieved by both devices working scarcely at all. Obviously, the latter is the more desirable solution from the point of view of the electricity bill, but as far as the object of maintaining the fixed temperature is concerned, every one of a large series of working rates is equally satisfactory. We have a line of equilibrium points rather than a single point. Well, I hope you agree that when you read this passage, you feel as if the author is pointing to something in the world, and upon reading it, you say, well, of course, now I can see that, anyone can see that. Well, here's an example of what is not classic prose, and this comes from the literary critic Judith Butler on changes in how we understand power in the political sense. The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural totalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies of the rearticulation of power. Well, here you have examples of classic prose on the one hand and non-classic prose on the other. Now, what are the features that distinguish them? Note that it is not a difference in the abstractness or the inherent difficulty of concepts. I think we would all agree that there is nothing obvious or simple about the concept of a line of equilibria as compared to, say, changing conceptions of power. So the writer points to the difference is that the writer points to things in the world that readers can see for themselves rather than making assertions that only the writer can vouch for. In contrast to the Dawkins passage, in which you, after reading it, you feel as if you understand it yourself, one can be quite impressed by the virtuosity of the verbal virtuosity of the passage by Butler, can kind of nod because it's so impressive that this person could put those words together, but still not seeing in any way independent of that string of words what on earth she's talking about. The prose itself ought not to be the object of attention, but a window onto something in the world. So it's a mistake to think of writing as a performance, as an object of appreciation or wonder in and of itself. Its value is only insofar as it serves as a window onto something in the world that one can picture in the mind's eye. So the prose is crafted to orient the reader's attention to that thing, particularly ensuring that the reader not be distracted by eye-catching but irrelevant details. So if the model is first you orient the reader, then you tell the reader what to attend to and what not to attend to. So notice that in the Dawkins passage, there are a number of cases where he anticipates something that could very well divert the reader from the intended point. Well, you think of the heater and the cooler, and all of this is an analogy to how widow birds evolve their preposterous tails. And you might think that get confused. Well, wait a sec. Isn't the whole point of the thermostat to keep the temperature constant, not to have it go wildly off in some extravagant direction? And that's when Dawkins says, wait a sec, don't pay attention right now to the temperature. Pay attention to the rate of consumption of electricity, which you can see, even while keeping the temperature constant, can wildly fluctuate. Likewise, later in the passage, notes, again, a possible misdirection of the reader's attention. Obviously, you don't want the electricity bill to be extravagant, but he notes that if the devices are simply set up to maintain the equilibrium, nothing prevents it from being extravagant, and once again ensures that the reader not be confused by that seductive tangent. Another assumption of classic prose is that the reader and writer are equally competent. And one of the best bits of advice that I got from an editor when I first started writing for the public, based on her experience with lots of academics who tried to cross over, is she said, don't condescend to your reader. Don't assume that you are writing for chicken pluckers and truck drivers and grannies, because then that will lead you to condescend and patronize on the assumption that academics are smart and everyone else isn't. That is not the problem with academic writing. You should be writing for someone who is as intelligent and as hardworking as you are, but happens not to have gone into your line of work. And so accessible prose is not the same as baby talk or motherese. It's rather taking account of the fact that other people don't know what you do, a point that I will return to. Now, note classic prose also doesn't require that the prose be completely effortless on the part of the reader. Even in reading that passage from Dawkins, one has to put some mental effort into mapping the analogy onto the original phenomenon to be explained, the evolution of extravagant male traits. But in putting that mental effort in, one is rewarded by an understanding of the process. So it's not that you have to make it completely easy for the reader, but rather, if the reader is willing to put in the effort to follow what you're pointing to, the reader will then be rewarded with that understanding. Fourth, the focus is on the thing being shown, not on the activity of studying it. So the classic prose ought not to dwell on what the writer happens to do for a living, the clique that they belong to and try to impress, their peer group, how they spend their days, and so on. And this, I have found, is one of the main differences that distinguishes academic writing from good classic prose. I'll give you an example. My own field of child language acquisition, I have seen umpteen review papers that begin something like this. In recent years, an increasing number of researchers have turned their attention to the problem of child language acquisition. In this article, recent theories of this process will be reviewed. Any of you should be familiar with the kind of article that begins in that way. Now, as it happens, very few people are actually interested in how academics spend their days, or what they have been doing has changed over the last few years. What you're really interested in is the actual phenomenon. So better would be if the article began, all children acquire the ability to speak and understand a language without explicit lessons. How do they accomplish that feat? That is, you are pointing the reader to the phenomenon in the world, kids acquire language, not to what you do for a living, what your pals do for a living, how you spend your day. And this is part of a more general point, which is a bit of advice that people, academics, bureaucrats, business people, are often advised to do, and which I think could be understood as a corollary of the model of classic prose. Namely, to minimize meta-discourse, that is, writing about the writing. So excessive signposting, we have just reviewed structuralist theories. Next, it will be necessary to summarize functionalist theories. But first, constructionist theories must be discussed. The problem with the signposting is that there is so much talk about the talk that you lose track of what is actually being talked about, keeping track of the structure of the writing itself. Apologizing, again, something that you don't do if you imagine yourself pointing to something in the world that you want the reader to see as well. So again, a typical introduction to an academic article. The problem of language acquisition is extremely complex. It is difficult to give precise definitions of the concept of language and the concept of acquisition and the concept of children. There is much uncertainty about the interpretation of experimental data and a great deal of controversy surrounding the theories. More research needs to be done. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of verbiage. And a reader who doesn't belong to this clique is apt to say, OK, stop kvetching and just tell me what you have to say. And one other tick that goes along with this non-classic prose is the compulsive hedging, the salting of sentences with hedges and qualifiers like somewhat, fairly, nearly, almost, in part, partially, relatively, comparatively, predominantly, to some extent, to a certain degree, etc. And the way I cured myself of this habit was remembering a colleague who pulled out a picture of her baby daughter and said, "We virtually adore her." Now, I'm sure she was a perfectly affectionate mother, but the tick of qualifying everything had so penetrated her self-presentation that she couldn't even talk about her love for her own cute little baby without engaging in this habit. Why the compulsive hedging? I think it's fairly obvious that most academic and business and political and bureaucratic writers follow the principle CYA, cover your anatomy, or at least certain parts of it. But the alternative, and this does require a little bit of courage, is to say what you have to say and take the attitude, "So sue me." That is, it may not be, there indeed may be exceptions, qualifications, and so on, but you don't have to constantly remind the reader of them. The reason is that the ideals of classic prose don't depend on the writer literally believing that all of the canons of classic prose are true. You don't have to be a naive realist to actually believe the truth can be known, it's there for everyone to see. Rather, you write as if they are true, and you count on the reader to fill in all the missing hedges and apologies and qualifications and so on, counting on the following ubiquitous property of the language comprehension process, which is that we all read between the lines. We all fill in details that are probabilistically implied by the content, even if they're not stated explicitly, what linguists sometimes call conversational implicature. An example is the classic haiku on the shampoo bottle: wet hair, lather, rinse, repeat. Now, when you read that, you understand that when you repeat, you don't have to wet your hair again, because it already is wet. And when it says repeat, it means repeat once. You don't have to go into an infinite loop and keep repeating and repeating and repeating. Now, the writers of this bit of prose did not spell that out. They didn't have to, because they could count on the common sense of the reader to fill that in. And that kind of common sense filling in is also what is essential in classic prose. Again, let me emphasize, because when you first hear it, it sounds obvious, but there's nothing obvious about it. That prose has to be classic, has to function as a window onto an independently existing reality. The words themselves are not the object of the effort. So one ought to avoid excessive abstraction, another great sin of academies, bureaucraties, governmenties, corporaties, and so on. An example from a paper that I co-authored with a colleague before I went over it was: subjects were administered the test materials under good to excellent conditions of acoustic isolation, which I changed to: the students filled out the questionnaire in a quiet room. There is no difference between a quiet room and good to excellent conditions of acoustic isolation. They are the same thing. So if you are pointing to something in the world, point to something in the world. Another notorious sin of academic writing is what linguists call nominalizations. That is thingification. Verbs converted into nouns with ion, ul, udge, ment. English has many ways of converting verbs to nouns, and it's a great help to the thinker in abstracting an entire event and giving it one label, turning it into a mental thing, but it requires the reader then to unpack it in a effortful and clumsy way. Let me just give you an example to show it's not just a sin of academics, but also of politicians and public relations hacks. A couple of weeks ago, Florida Governor Rick Scott today sought to calm fears about a possible hurricanes threatening to close down the Republican National Convention, telling reporters this afternoon, right now there is not any anticipation that there will be a cancellation. Anticipation and cancellation are both nominalizations. He could just as easily have said, right now we don't anticipate that we will have to cancel it. Third, the ideal of prose as a window, as opposed to an object to be appreciated itself, is that it reminds you not to use words as memorized formulas, but rather to remind yourself what they actually refer to. An example is the use of cliches. There's a set of widely circulating fumble rules, that is, rules that humorously flout themselves, of which my favorite is fumble rule number 17, avoid cliches like the plague. Now, we have all used avoid X like the plague, but think about it. When was the last time that you actually did avoid the plague? Prose that is larded with cliches that, if you actually formed mental images, would not make a whole lot of sense, are often give the impression of being turgid, hackneyed, and in general unpleasant to read. Mixed metaphors are a variation of the failure to think of prose as a window. Once you open a can of worms, they always come home to roost. Those professors tilt at the windmills of capitalist patriarchy from whose teat they feed. A windmill with teats. It can give rise to inadvertently tasteless expressions. Like I was once listening to a pop psychology show in which the therapist radio host said, for some patients, cancer can be a growth experience. The notorious Goldwynisms, named after the movie mogul Samuel Goldwyn, such as an oral agreement isn't worth the paper it's written on. And members of the club called Awful, Americans who figuratively use literally, of whom the charter member, those of you in the audience who are my age might remember during the Watergate scandal that besieged President Richard Nixon had a stalwart defender, Rabbi Baruch Korf, who at one point said, the press has literally emasculated President Nixon. And so he is the charter member of Awful. Okay, part two, and I will be a bit briefer here, although there is a tremendous amount of relevant material. How does language allow a writer to direct a reader's gaze to some object or scene? That is the goal. Okay, how do you accomplish it? A way to think of how language works is to differentiate the web, the chain, and the tree. The web is a way of thinking about the knowledge that the writer has. Cognitive psychologists often characterize a person's state of knowledge in terms of a semantic network, a kind of mind-wide web, which I'll illustrate appropriately in a lecture in the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering with the world's most famous nuclear engineer, Homer Simpson. This is perhaps a very simplified diagram of a typical person's knowledge of The Simpsons. Notice that there are nodes for concepts, there are connections among them, there are images attached to the concepts, and what's important is the topology of the network, what is connected to what. You could draw it on the page however you want, as long as the right things are connected to one another. However, a sentence is not like a web. It is a linear chain of words. We speak, as it were, left to right. We can only utter one word at a time, such as Homer works in a power plant. We have to get parts of that web of knowledge out through a serial interface. So the process of writing is to convert a network of ideas into a linear string of words. The process of reading, to simplify, is to convert a string of words back to that network of ideas. And mediating between them is a hierarchical tree, something that groups words into phrases that more or less correspond to chunks of knowledge, and that put words that are semantically related close to each other, but that also specify a left to right order, which of course will differ in different languages. So the trees are the tools that the writer has to work with in order to convey bits of knowledge. The connectedness in the tree, what words are adjacent to what, corresponds really to the semantic content, to who did what to whom. The left to right order of words is a resource that the writer exploits to track the reader's flow of attention in real time. What the reader attends to first, And this distinction roughly corresponds to the famous distinction that Noam Chomsky made in the 1960s between deep and surface structure. So among the principles that govern the left to right order of words is that early material in the sentence ought to correspond to the topic, to the information that's given, to what the reader is generally looking at. You take your reader, you point them to some object. That is what the material early in the sentence tends to do. The later material can be called the focal point or the stress position or the new information. It's once you have the reader looking at something, now you tell them what to notice, what to ignore. Prose that violates these principles tends to feel choppy or disjointed or hard to follow. And that is possibly the second sin of bad writing, the first being prose that feels turgid or bloated or opaque. And the way to avoid prose that's choppy or disjointed is to take advantage of the way that different grammatical constructions will map chunks of a semantic network onto a linear order, different linearization tools. And that is why, this is a lead-up to why advice such as the Strunk and Whiteian avoid the passive is bad advice. It is certainly true that many bureaucrats, academics, corporate hacks, and so on use the passive too often. But nonetheless, the fact that Strunk and White themselves could not stick with their own advice shows that the story is more complicated. There is a need for the passive if you understand what grammatical constructions are for. Why do languages have active and passive constructions? Well, roughly speaking, an active, the dog chased the cat, and the passive, the cat was chased by the dog, have more or less the same or highly similar deep structures referring to who did what to whom, but different surface orders, namely what the reader encounters first in real time. And the passive is in fact the better construction when the entity that is affected, the patient, the target of the action, ought to come earlier in the sentence because the reader is already, in a sense, looking at it. It's already the topic of the conversation. To give you a concrete and somewhat gruesome example that I clipped out of the paper, the dead included at least 7 United Nations workers. 2 of them had been beheaded. There is a reason that the writer chose the passive voice there instead of militants had beheaded 2 of them. Namely, your focus of attention is already on the dead, that is, on the victims of an action. If you are now adding information about them, the topic, namely the victims, ought to come early in the sentence. The passive voice allows you to do that. Part 3, why is it so hard for writers to use language to share ideas? Why do we have to spell all these things out if prose is in the ideal is simply getting a reader to see what you, the writer, are looking at? The answer, I think, comes from a branch of a topic in cognitive psychology misleadingly called theory of mind. A better word for it would be intuitive psychology. Theory of mind is not a scientific theory of the kind that a psychologist would propose, but rather the implicit or tacit or intuitive theory that every human being has about what makes other people tick. And one of the most famous research findings in intuitive psychology is that children below the age of 4 have a great deal of difficulty in exercising this mental faculty, so-called theory of mind, that is, in grasping that other people may not have the state of knowledge that they have. The M&M's task is a classic demonstration. You bring a 3-year-old into a lab, give them a box of M&M's, they open it up, and what do they find? A bunch of ribbons instead of the M&M's that they expect. So the child is surprised and laughs and so on. Then you say, well, now Ryan is going to come into the room. You put the ribbons back in the box. What does he think is in the box? And the 3-year-olds will say, ribbons. Now, of course, Ryan, who just came into the room, has no way of knowing that the M&M box has ribbons, just like the child himself had no way of knowing. But the child cannot differentiate his own state of knowledge from that of some third party. Now, it turns out, even though we in psychology say this is an accomplishment that any 4-year-old has mastered. In fact, it is a lifetime's work to master this feat, and adults aren't so good at it either. We can pass the M&M's task, barely, but when it comes to adults, there is a parallel phenomenon called the curse of knowledge. Namely, it's extraordinarily difficult to know what it is like for someone else not to know what you do know, even for we adults. And the curse of knowledge is one of the chief contributors to opaque writing. So, for example, if I were to have said to you, humans have limitations in their theory of mind, as is shown by the false belief task, which is a typical way in which an academic might explain this bit of psychology, you would have no way of knowing what on earth that means, because theory of mind in the special technical sense in which psychologists use it, and false belief task as a shorthand label for the M&M's box with the ribbons in it, are something that you only acquire if you go to graduate school in psychology. It is surprisingly easy for academics to forget that other people have not mastered all of the arcane knowledge that they themselves have mastered. Well, how do you exercise the curse of knowledge? Well, I suppose the most obvious one is just to keep it in mind, to explicitly conjure up the reader over your shoulder and constantly ask yourself, what would my target audience reasonably know or not know? But again, even when you try to do that, it's extraordinarily difficult. Better is to show a draft to a representative reader. People are often surprised when I say that everything that I write I show to a number of people and I get comments, not just experts in my field to correct any errors that I've made, but I also show it for every chapter of every book to my mother. And when I say that, it is not a condescending or sexist remark, oh, show it to someone who can't really grasp all of this fancy schmancy stuff that we academics do. Quite the contrary. My mother is an extraordinarily intelligent and well-read and sophisticated woman. She happens not to be a professor of psychology, and so she is the ideal reader to remind me, what in the world are you talking about? If she has no way of knowing, then I know that I have suffered from the curse of knowledge. Allow some time to pass and reread your own draft. Usually several months or more is ideal. All of my books go through 5 to 6 drafts before being sent to the copy editor. And the advantage of that is not just successive passes at tweaking and improving, but when you set something aside and come back to it after doing a bunch of other stuff, I often have the experience of reading it and thinking, who wrote this crap? What the hell is he talking about? Oh, I wrote it. And oneself, over time, can be a surrogate for the generic reader. And another timeless bit of advice, read it aloud. Since the model of classic prose is conversation, a lot of locutions and verbiage that seem to look okay when they're just pixels on a screen just don't work when they have to be read aloud. Final topic is how, and by far the most contentious, controversial, and emotional topic when it comes to style is how should we think about correct usage? On the one hand, we can all agree that there are some forms that are just plain wrong. For example, there is no such word as misunderestimated. The citizens of modern Greece are called Greeks, not Grecians. And divisive policies do not Vulcanize society, they Balkanize society. In fact, even the gentleman who produced these words admitted in a self-deprecating speech that they are objectively incorrect. On the other hand, many rules claiming that certain forms are correct or incorrect are what I think of as bubamaises, Yiddish for grandmother's tales or old wives' tales. That is, they have no basis in reality, but are just passed on by sheer repetition. Strunk and White have a number of them, like it's an error to say 5 people, or that a clever horse is an ingenious one. They claim that finalize is a grievous solecism, that to contact is an error. There's a rule out there that hopefully may only mean in a hopeful manner. So it is, according to this Bubamaisa, hopefully the storm will miss us is grammatically incorrect. You must say, it is hoped that the storm will miss us. Split infinitives. I bet many people in this room don't even know what a split infinitive is, but here is an example. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. According to the purist, this ought to be to go boldly where no man has gone before, to which I say, beam me up, Scotty, there's no intelligent life down here. And finally, there's the notorious rule against ending a sentence with a preposition, to which Winston Churchill allegedly said, this is the kind of pedantry up with which I shall not put. Now, grammarians, historians, scholars who try to track down where these rules of usage come from are unanimous that many of them violate grammatical logic. They do not improve the clarity or grace of prose, such as it is hoped that the storm will pass, which violates the rules against passives, against excess words, against abstractions, and so on. They're routinely flouted by the best writers. You could look it up, and have always been flouted by the best writers. So how do we make sense of this seeming paradox that many alleged rules of usage are Bubamaisas, but nonetheless, the errors of George W. Bush really were errors even by his own admission. Now, rules of usage are not officially regulated. We do not have a language academy that legislates correct usage. And you might say, well, that's what dictionaries are for. Well, I happen to be the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary, and I asked the editor of the dictionary, how do you make decisions as to what you deem correct or incorrect? And he says, well, we pay attention to the way that people use language. That is, there's no one in charge. The lunatics are running the asylum. And rules of usage are not an unchanging fact about the world. They are not like the laws of physics or the empirical phenomena of biology. What are rules of usage? Well, I've put it in green to emphasize how important I think this is. Rules of usage are tacit evolving conventions. What do I mean by conventions? Convention is a behavioral decision that a community makes, not because there isn't anything inherently superior about doing it that way, but there is something inherently superior about everyone doing it the same way, whatever it is. Driving on the right versus the left. There's nothing wrong with driving on the left if everyone else agrees to do it that way. But this is really a case in which you don't want to march to the beat of your own drummer. Paper currency, the Gregorian calendar, internet protocols, and so on. Tacit, well, unlike, say, an internet protocol, where there's often a standardization committee that decides on the protocol, the conventions of correct usage emerge as a rough consensus in a community of careful writers without explicit deliberation, agreement, or legislation. And evolving, the consensus may change over time, as in the verb to contact, which I suspect no one in this room even realized is supposed to be a grammatical error. So how should a writer deal with usage issues with this knowledge? Well, this is a surprisingly dumb but profound answer. Well, first of all, don't blow them off. The fact that many rules are bogus doesn't mean that everyone should write as they please, because conforming to the rules of usage can ease comprehension on the part of the reader, can credibly signal that a writer has exercised care in crafting the passage. If you get a message asking you to verify your password with your bank account, and it has 4 grammatical errors in it, you can bet that it didn't really come from your bank. And it provides a stable platform for the development of style and grace. And so attention to fine points of usage, the preferred use of words like disinterested, flaunt versus flout, fortuitous versus fortunate, fulsome, infer, mitigate. There is a pleasure in reading the prose of a writer who attends to the expectations of fellow literate writers in using those words in the accepted way. But not every pet peeve bit of grammatical folklore or dimly remembered lesson from Mrs. Grundy is necessarily a legitimate rule of usage. How do you distinguish the legitimate rules from the bogus ones? Well, this is a surprising answer, but look them up. Now, why is that both dumb and profound at the same time? Well, yeah, of course you look them up, you might reply. But it turns out that many of these bogus rules are purely folklore in the sense that no grammatical expert, no dictionary, no rule of style ever said that there was anything wrong with them. For example, so in usage notes and dictionaries, style manuals, I have not found a single style manual that bans the split infinitive or prepositions at the end of sentences. They all have, for at least a century, they say there's nothing wrong with these constructions. It's strictly rumor, conjecture, bits of folklore passed along. And indeed, there is an analog to this in the study of conventions, a phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance, also called the spiral of silence or the Abilene paradox, which is there is a danger in conventions that everyone thinks that someone else believes something, but no one themselves actually believes it. A famous example is the time-honored campus tradition of drinking until you puke and pass out. If you actually interview every fraternity brother, and they say, do you think it's really cool to get so drunk that you puke and pass out? They say, oh no, I think that's disgusting. But all of my friends, they all think that it's cool. And you ask every single one of them, and everyone thinks that everyone else thinks it's cool, but no one thinks it's cool. That can happen. And that is what happens in a number of bogus rules of usage. Everyone thinks that someone else thinks that the split infinitive is ungrammatical, whereas no one will actually aver that it is ungrammatical. So to sum up, modern linguistics and cognitive science, I believe, can provide better ways of enhancing our prose. They can suggest an idealized model of prose communication, namely classic style, an understanding of the machinery of prose, namely the mapping between the web, the chain, and the tree, a diagnosis of why good prose is so hard to write, namely the curse of knowledge, and a way to make sense of rules of correct usage, namely that they are tacit but evolving conventions. My final suggestion is that most writers don't master good prose by following a set of guidelines, but the time-honored method of doing it is to find a piece, is to enjoy it. Find a piece of writing that gives you a great deal of pleasure and try to reverse engineer it. Figure out why you're enjoying it so much. What did the writer do that made it so classic? And as an example, I will give you my favorite prose passage, an essay called The Owl by a 10-year-old boy who is given the assignment of writing about a bird and a beast. And what it lacks in zoological accuracy, it makes up for in clarity of expression. The owl. The bird that I'm going to write about is the owl. The owl cannot see at all by day, and at night is as blind as a bat. I do not know much about the owl, so I will go on to the beast that I'm going to choose. It is the cow. The cow is a mammal. It has 6 sides, right, left, and upper and below. At the back it has a tail on which hangs a brush. With it, it sends the flies away so that they do not fall into the milk. The head is for the purpose of growing horns, and so that the mouth can be somewhere. The horns are to butt with, and the mouth is to moo with. Under the cow hangs the milk. It is arranged for milking. When people milk, the milk comes through, and there's never any end to the supply. How the cow does it, I have not yet realized, but it makes more and more. The cow has a fine sense of smell. One can smell it far away. This is the reason for the fresh air in the country. The man cow is called an ox. It is not a mammal. The cow does not eat much, but what it eats twice so that it gets enough. When it's hungry, it moos, and when it says nothing, it is because its inside is all full up with grass. Ladies and gentlemen, let that be your model. Thank you. Thank you. We'll have some questions. Yes, are there any questions? Yes.
Tell us about prose. There's, of course, another idiom out there called poetry.
Yes.
Maybe one can think that you can point in the same way, just a different scene. It's a different cloud. But I'm wondering if you can tell whether or not the same rules might all apply to poetry.
Yes, that's a really good question. And classic, oh, I'm sorry, the mic's still on? Yes. The question is, do these principles apply to poetry? Is it another way of calling a reader's attention to something in the world? I think there is an overlap between prose and poetry, and certainly many of the principles also apply. Avoiding cliches and thinking through idioms and metaphors, reminding yourself of what the language refers to. But of course, poetry also makes uses as a resource the sounds of the language. And poetry really is an object to be admired and appreciated qua string of words in a way that, according to the classic model of prose ought not to be. So it's sometimes said poetry is what gets lost in translation. So that is in part, the aspects of language that aren't simply used to point to something in the world are put to deliberate use in poetry. In addition, and one of the reasons I concentrate on classic prose, even though my nominal topic is writing in general, is that even creative writing that in fiction, in poetry, that flouts the canons of classic prose will often do so deliberately for effect. And that therefore knowing as a baseline or platform how classic prose ought to work, I think gives insight as to how it's often systematically manipulated, flouted, violated as a deliberate decision by the fiction or the poetry writer, or the ringing orator as well. Yes.
So everything that you said today was about writing at the what you might call the tactical level, the sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph level. Do you have any thoughts on the more strategic level of how do you the global thing that you're studying, the book that you're writing, and how you structure for the piece?
Yeah, no, that's another excellent question, and the general principle of the kind of the early-late principle, namely, one ought to direct the reader's attention to a particular entity kind of early, and then add the new information at the end, once the reader is looking at the right thing, can be elaborated at the level of the paragraph and the section and the essay as a whole. Now, so there is a certain fractal structure, namely you also, at the beginning of an essay, orient the reader in a particular direction, and then identify what exactly should be attended to as the paragraphs follow each other. But it does get a little bit more complex, but still involves the same constructs. That is, so it's not just early and late. That's not going to work at every single level. But the principles of discourse organization over longer structures have to keep in mind, or have to keep in mind what entities the reader is keeping in mind, so that the reader knows what is the general topic or set of topics, but it's often a string of topics, one after another, that's constantly kept in focus and extra information added to them. And the jumbled, choppy, disjointed sense that one gets from a poorly constructed paragraph or essay is often because there's a kind of whiplash or tennis, where the reader doesn't know what they're supposed to focus on. Yes?
Could you give advice to non-native speaker about how we can study or learn language, for example, English, to communicate in a way that sounds natural to native speakers?
Yes, a lot. I think the final point of reverse engineering good native prose is one way. Probably it's also inevitable that one will need feedback from native speakers, since native speakers themselves need feedback, don't get enough. And I think that requirement is redoubled in the case of a foreign language speaker. Yes?
There's an argument to be made that good writing respects all the conventions that you illustrate, but that great writing is great because it's relativistic, modernist, self-reflective, and ironic, and that applies to great scientific writing as well as great writing that you might read in New Yorker. Do we do ourselves and our students a disservice by focusing merely on good, competent writing as opposed to great writing?
I think that observation might be true of, certainly true of, say, James Joyce, where a lot of these are systematically flouted for an effect, I suspect, because Joyce was at least tacitly aware of this model and departed from it for specific reasons. It's less clear to me that it is generally true of great scientific writing. Scientific writing does have some extra things like flourishes at the beginning and the end, and sort of confessions of emotion and wonder when all is said and done. But I think that great scientific writing and great expository writing in general does have to adhere to these, and it's a tall order. It's very difficult to, in fact, much of the advice that goes into classic prose is not actually achievable. That is, you can't really have no signposting, nothing about this is what I'm going to say, or in sum, this is what I've said. To the extent that one can do the extraordinarily difficult achievement of mastering all of these bits of advice, I think that one has written great scientific prose, but the vast majority will fall short of that. Now, I might be wrong, and maybe the failure of the imagination, but it seems, but at least my first impression at answering your question would be that at least for expository writing, no, it's hard enough to master this. Yes. Yes?
Tension between scientific writing and writing as a more general skill is that in scientific writing we are concerned about the potential replication of the findings. So we have to convey lots of detailed, boring information. Like in the case of the quiet room, the author might wanted to tell us that they did something, they put something on the wall, and they did some acoustics in there. So some of those details are not completely irrelevant to draw. How would you find place in this trade-off?
Yeah, no, that is certainly true, that the principles of classic prose are not, in fact, attainable in primary writing in the scientific literature. Because for a number of reasons, namely that the conventions are that you really do have to hedge where a hedge is appropriate. One has to qualify. One's under greater scrutiny because of the adversarial nature of peer review and scientific argumentation. Likewise, in legal writing, in the drafting of contracts, one cannot leave anything to the imagination because your adversary will use it against you. So classic prose is an ideal that is not attainable in these and certain other media. Although, in my experience, even technical writing in the primary scientific literature can benefit enormously by moving in the direction of classic prose. That, in fact, for details such as replicability of findings, the difference between good to excellent conditions of acoustic isolation and a quiet room, in fact, a quiet room is far superior because it shows, no, you didn't put the guy in an anechoic chamber. Maybe that's why I can't replicate this guy's results. I didn't do it. I thought he did it in a sealed chamber. In fact, there was traffic going by and people laughing outside. So the more concrete detail in cases like that actually makes the ideal of scientific detail and replicability easier to achieve. I've often found in conveying scientific findings to the public, in fact, that if I go by typical secondary sources like literature reviews, and it just mentions something generic like geometric stimuli, and I know that I can't get away in talking to a non-specialist audience, we're talking about geometric stimuli, I have to know, were they squares, were they circles, were they stars, or we presented the children with age-appropriate materials. Well, is this the Cookie Monster, or is it Minnie Mouse? And so I will often go back to the primary literature and often find when I switch that it causes me in my hat as a scientist as opposed to a communicator to realize, hey, this is a crummy experiment. I always thought they did it this way. It's only when I go down to the actual concrete details of the kind that a generic reader would want that I realize what the flaws are in the original experiment papered over in too abstract language in literature reviews or textbooks. Yes, just want to alternate other different sides of the room. Yes.
Yeah, it seems like we assume that people read in the same way that they communicate verbally. They're reading aloud in their mind the same thing that you're someone reading. Do you find any differences in the sense that some people might not read that way, they might skip around from word to word, which you can't do listening to someone who's exactly right? Is there some reason that people want to do that?
Well, there certainly are different styles of reading, such as skimming versus reading directly. But I don't think, and Ted Gibson might correct me if I'm wrong, but in general, all forms of reading do involve some activation, at least tacitly, of the actual phonological representation of the word. The idea of reading that involves the kind of what the Evelyn Wood speed reading course promises, namely you just follow your finger down the page and there's no sounding out whatsoever at any level, is probably not attainable in any kind of prose comprehension.
Also apply to languages which are more symbolistic, that aren't driven by the sounds of the word, but by how you like Chinese characters, for example.
Yes, no, it would also apply in Chinese because, for one thing, it's a difference in the orthographic system, but it's not really a difference in the language itself. So it's just the history of how the Chinese characters developed. But even in languages like Chinese, the symbols on the page don't map onto concepts directly in a one-to-one manner, but different components do map onto units whose sound is used in mapping often various homophones onto words with completely different meanings but the same sound onto the same character in the page. So it's a general property of even the more ideographic writing systems evolve in the direction of becoming sound-based. Now, not in the case of English, more or less phoneme-based, where every squiggle on the page is a vowel or consonant. More commonly, there are syllables or other units of sound above the vowel or consonant, but the path from writing to language always goes through phonology. That is abstract sound. Doctor, yes?
Searching for the absence of a convention is very difficult and time-consuming. You mentioned that you put a lot of time into reading books and you didn't find specific bubble lists. Do you know of any resource that compiles all the bubble lists?
Yeah, actually, a lot of style manuals will, well, I plan to do this in mine, is to put them all together. That is, all the ones that various smarty pants and know-it-alls and dimly remembered lessons from English teachers will advise you to do, but you can pretty safely ignore, from the ones that are worth following. I think that the existing style manuals, to various extents, do discuss the Bobomyces. And if you look up, and even better are the usage notes in dictionaries. I'll show a little bit for the American Heritage, just it's the one that I know best. But Merriam-Webster's also has usage notes. So if you go to the dictionary and find either the possibly problematic word or the name for the construction that you're worried about, such as you look up split infinitive under S or prepositions under P, there'll generally be a usage note that will guide you through the history, like use it at your own risk. There's nothing wrong with it, but so many people think there's something wrong with it that you're taking a chance. And that's why the usage notes are so invaluable in a modern dictionary. And why, by the way, probably a lot of people nowadays, in fact, probably no one actually lifts that huge physical tome, puts it on your lap, spreads it out, moves your finger down. Most people probably go to dictionary.com. There are online versions now, though, of the real dictionaries. The American Heritage comes in an iPhone and iPad app, which you get for free if you buy the dictionary. But the main advantage of the name brand dictionaries over dictionary.com is that you get the usage notes. And they don't say it's wrong, it's right. They'll say, this is what you should expect your readers, how you should expect your readers to react.
We'll have to make this the last question. Mark, I think you had a question.
Oh, me? Oh, thank you, Brad. Yeah, so I found that there's actually not a whole lot, but a little bit of like resistance to using this classic style in like, the hard science and engineering and technical writing. And I try to use this style. I try to write like very directly and clearly in the classic style that you've explained. And most people will appreciate reading what I write, but occasionally I do get some criticism, and the criticism will usually be along the lines of, they'll say, oh, this is too colloquial. Mm-hmm. Or they'll say, the one I really hate is they'll say it's not professional enough. Because I didn't use enough like strange words. Right. And so what should I say to those people?
No, that is the reality. It's not a facetious question, and there's no exact answer because, for one thing, there are legitimate reasons sometimes to deviate from classic style, such as the certain hedges you have to make, and the other is, as you say, just the general conventions of the genre that you happen to be writing in. And I think one generally has to muddle through in a middle way. That is, there's enormous room for improvement of your typical academic prose that doesn't bring you all the way to the New York Times or a magazine article, but is much better. So it still retains those traces of academies that prove that you belong to the club, that lamentably, as you point out, we're all forced to include, but still avoids the worst excesses of muddy, bloated academies. That's the best advice I could give.
Well, so unlike Professor Strunk, who apparently repeated himself twice, we only had Professor Pinker once. I wish we had him 3 times, but we'll take what we can get. Thank you very much.